Thank you, folks, for being here today. My name is Kimberly White. I am a proud alumnus, and I have the privilege of working in the alumni office here at PLNU. And I'm so grateful to those of you who have helped prepare the Loma Talk today. And I'm especially grateful for those who are tuning in, who have chosen to gather with us during this lunch hour. So thank you for being here again. This summer, the Alumni Office has teamed up with our alumni board members to bring you our summer road trip series, where we are connecting with our university community, both virtually and in person all across the nation. Today, we're joined by our Arizona regional representative, Katie Gent, who will later on share some information about this weekend's meetup in Arizona. Before today's talk, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple quick announcements. Throughout our time together, feel free to utilize the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, to ask questions. Scott will take those questions at the end of the presentation. This session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing on the PLNU Alumni YouTube channel. And now, without further delay, allow me to introduce you to today's speaker. We're excited to hear from Scott Stevens. Scott composes music for films, trailers, and advertisements with talented directors and corporate clients. Good stories tell the truth, and Scott endeavors to do the same with his music, whatever the project. His most joyful collaborations have been with storytellers who exude genuine compassion for people and the great imagination. Scott graduated from PLNU in 2011 with a bachelor's in music and composition, and also from SDSU in 2013 with a master's in music and global music composition. He scored and co-produced a biopic last February with the award-winning producer and director Jared Callahan about the complicated life and death of beloved PLNU jazz professor Dan Nelson. Scott and his wife Callie, who is also an alum, will be moving to London this fall. Welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, thanks, Kimberly. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're looking forward to hearing all you have to share with us.
Oh, wow. No pressure. Also, I'll just clear the air before we get in. I did have a snack of peanut butter, so if I have to take a glass of water or a sip from this really low-key Nalgene every once in a while, don't mind me. It's Phoenix, it's dry. Got to stay hydrated, you know. All right. Well, as you know, and I said this before we started the call, I can talk huge word bubbles, and we could start with a question, or if you want me to get right into it, I can get right into it. What's your preference?
We would love just to hear, Scott, about your journey, your university experience, and what you've been up to now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then, yeah, we'll start with PLNU. I came to PLNU in 07 and was not sure if I wanted to do music or study literature. I was leaning towards music, and I'm really very satisfied with having done that. I think my heart, my soul leans more heavily towards music than it does other art forms. And I was really fortunate to study with Victor Lubinsky, who I saw is on the call, who helped me achieve a degree in composition. And that was a really wonderful experience. And just to echo, I think what Destin Cretton was talking about in one of the earlier interviews this year during homecoming. Destin Cretton's a film director who also graduated from Point Loma a few years ahead of me. It was just a really safe and welcoming community to explore and learn and be shaped. And so while I was at Point Loma, I got to develop a little bit of my writing voice and try writing in different styles and forms. And I have to really tip my hat to Dr. Lubinsky, because I think composition is kind of hard to teach. You can teach techniques, but it's hard to try and help students really find out what their own voice is. And, I'm now a couple of years graduated from Point Loma and even had an opportunity to do grad school and study composition further. And I'm still figuring out what my voice is. So yeah, Point Loma was a real launching point. And importantly, while I was at Point Loma, I got to play in the concert band, and it was in concert band that I met my wife, Callie, which, we hit it off. We both played saxophone and, flirted during band class. So that worked out. Um, yeah, so I'm really, really grateful to Point Loma for shaping a lot of that musical journey. And I feel like coming out of that program, there's other professors I haven't even named, but they all helped give me a really, really solid foundation to move into film scoring today. And I didn't even know I wanted to be a film composer when I was at Point Loma and had first started. That sort of came later. And so to go a little further down the road, while I was at Point Loma my sophomore year, we had a guest named Eric Schmidt. And at the time he was a professor at USC, but you'd know some of the stuff that he's worked on. He did the music for the Tom and Jerry cartoons back in the day. And he sort of gave me and a couple other composition students an inside look at how he did music for television shows and for movies. And I was going, man, this is fascinating. It seems like a kind of composition where you can make a living. It's cool that you get to pair music with stories. And so perked my curiosity. And through a series of relationships that just kind of came into my path through recommendations of friends or professors, I gradually got pulled further and just kept following my curiosity till when I was in my grad program at San Diego State, I had an opportunity to do my very first film. That was a really interesting experience. I was in the middle of this like group music class, and a film student came in and had basically said, hey, I really need music for a movie. Is there anyone that's interested? And apparently I was the first or maybe only one to volunteer. And I had a blast and went, this is really, really fun. I would love to keep doing this. And so I'll keep the rest of this short. Long story short, after grad school, I moved to Los Angeles, which if you know anything about movies, a lot of them are made in Los Angeles. So that seemed like a very obvious next place for me to live. And I saw that Larry Wrench is on this call, and I need to mention Larry Wrench because he is one of the most talented orchestrators, but I think more importantly, one of the best people I know. And when I came to LA, I didn't know that many people. I was fortunate in that my roommates were filmmakers, so that was just already an exciting, living situation to start with. But I came to get to know Larry. We both were attending the same church and in Pasadena, and he showed me just really his heart for music and film, and shared with me ways that he manages, stress and there's a lot that I won't have time to get into today. But all I really want to say is that to be doing what I'm doing today took a lot of investment from other people who really took me under their wing and showed me how to do more aspects of the craft I just didn't even understand. So yeah, I'm very, very grateful. And it is totally all about who you know, which can sound really intimidating and nepotistic. But I think if you focus less on the nepotistic and think, what are our lives if not the sum of the relationships that we have with people, then that puts the emphasis in the right place, which is trying to form friendships, relationships. Yeah. So I will transition from the background material into what we're talking about today, which is how do we honor cultures through film and through music. And I'd be remiss if I didn't explain a little bit of my background. And I also want to say to all the viewers, anyone who watches this later, I fully recognize I'm a white male. There are privileges and things that I am still discovering. And as I talk about this very, 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 very large topic, which we cannot condense down to, 20 minutes, it's bigger than that. I'm not an expert, but I have written music and I have, the experiences that I can offer. And I hope that shows you some of my love and passion for the diversity that is even just within music as well as film. So rewinding, this is pre-Point Loma. I was at the age of 7 and had grown up in a small desert community in the Mojave Desert called Ridgecrest. And I find out my family, my mom, my dad, and myself are going to be moving to Japan. And that rocked my world. And I was nervous. And we finally went and arrived. And shortly thereafter, I was enrolled in an international school, which was one of the best things really ever to happen to me, because I had friends from Iran, I had friends from Saudi Arabia, from Malaysia, from India, from Japan, obviously, because I'm living in Japan. And so I got to be in a classroom full of people who had very vastly different experiences than I had. And what the school did an amazing job of was really instilling in their students an appreciation for many, many ways of thinking, many different cultures. You know, some of that would get lumped into maybe like geography classes, but we're talking about music here. And I took up piano, and then later had an opportunity to study how music could be formed into a sonata, which is a music form that's kind of long and very complex, but we disassembled that, and that was cool. But then we moved on to the study of African polyrhythms, which also blew my mind and was something vastly different than what I had heard before. And then after that, we moved on to a study of Indian folk music. And I'm learning like, oh my gosh, there are so many different notation systems than just, you know, what I'm learning on piano, which is the black and the white keys. And there's, you know, different keys you can play in. And so that was just a wealth of knowledge to get to tap into. And I don't know if I would have done that as much or been able to go as deep as I did if I hadn't had that experience. And another thing that was really formative to me and really opened my ears up to possibilities I hadn't considered was my dad. My dad's a guitarist. He used to, you know, shred in some bands back in the day. And he had a really, really big appreciation for jazz guitarists. And the thing about at least the jazz guitarists that he listened to is they had an affinity for collaborating with people from, you know, outside of the US. And so I grew up listening to like Vietnamese jazz guitarists who would collaborate with incredible percussionists from India who would play tabla drums and mridangam drums. If you don't know what those are, come to the MIM this week. You'll see a whole array of instruments you've probably never seen. And so there was this real cross-pollination of musical styles and musical cultures that became kind of normal for me. You know, little Scott, age 7, probably would have said, "Dad, why do you listen to that weird music?" Which is totally insensitive, but remember, I'm 7, so don't judge too harshly. And at the, you know, after a while, like that started to kind of be associated with home, which is maybe not everyone's experience, but when you grow up with a dad who has such an eclectic record collection, and at school you're you know, attending taiko drum performances and studying about African polyrhythm and Indian folk music, and you know, all of this at the same time, it was just a really, really formative period for me. And what I came to appreciate is that there are instruments outside of, you know, Western European tradition which just dominate so much of film score today, because it's, you know, it's what we're very familiar with. And so it's honestly a relief to me to know like, oh, you know, if I want to play something that's kind of, let's just say we'll go cross synesthete here, something that's kind of blue, there's like thousands of shades of blue out there. You don't have to just use a violin or a cello or a piano to express yourself, or horns or things that you might associate with like a symphonic orchestra. Now, I should mention that if we're talking about how we honor different cultures, there's a real pitfall that I think every composer needs to be very aware of, and that's, you know, don't co-opt a tradition that you don't know anything about. And I think, you know, rather than focus too much on the, oh, I don't want to do this, help me not, you know, help me not be insensitive. The most successful film scores that really honored cultures in a beautiful way, I think, have had teams of people, not just the composer, who were super, super passionate about trying to show the beauty of maybe one kind of culture. And you have composers who try to, with sincerity, with honesty, with vulnerability, become more acquainted with maybe a tradition that's outside of what's familiar to them. So like a great example of that that's happened in recent times is the film Black Panther. Ludwig Göransson was the composer for that film, and he's from Sweden. And he got to know Ryan Coogler, the director of the film, while they were in school. And anytime you work with a director, it's a bond of trust that gets formed. You hear about like maybe John Williams and Steven Spielberg, who often get touted as like these titans of collaboration, and look at these amazing things they made, and they were great stories. But there's so much trust there, and so Black Panther comes along. Ludwig Göransson gets hired, and Ludwig Göransson decided, you know what? If we're going to be telling kind of an origin story that is set in Africa and has Black characters, then we can't just slap a symphonic orchestra on there. And if you listen to any of the soundtracks from Marvel films, while they do vary, there's stylistic difference. A lot of them do have like horns, right? Strings, percussion that is usually found in like a symphonic orchestra, and that works for a lot of audiences because that's what we're used to hearing. But Ludwig Göransson went a little deeper and said, I'm going to travel I'm going to go to South Africa and explore some of the archives there and explore some of the traditions there and see if I can even find a couple of musicians who would be willing to help enrich the soundtrack and keep it grounded in a language that is not necessarily Western Symphonic Orchestra. So he partnered with a singer from Senegal named Baba Mal, who is absolutely incredible. If you haven't listened to that soundtrack on its own, do that. Watch the film too. That's really, really good. But the soundtrack is a treat. And Baba Mal, being from Senegal and being kind of more in the middle of that music community, pulled in some other musicians. And so these musicians from a completely different non-Western musical tradition started getting in the same studio, throwing ideas back and forth, and Ludwig Göransson is there and is a sponge and is somewhat directing. He has some ideas, but I think I'll share with you a little excerpt from an article I found that I think says this in a really, really cool way and kind of captures the heart of what I hope more composers do and making their soundtracks. So they basically say Göransson built the score on the foundation of these and other elements, these being like native Africana sounds, and including an overall sense of traditional rhythm inspired by a trove of recordings he found at the International Library of African Music in South Africa. So again, that's Ludwig Göransson doing the homework before he started writing the score. He, Ludwig, then planted the requisite superheroic symphony orchestra and hip-hop beats into that soil being traditional African music rather than the other way around. And if you've seen the film and understand some of what its impact has culturally, it's staggering. And I think that was a really, really beautiful journey. And I'm really, really glad that someone wrote about it, because this is the kind of stuff that people need to know. So I'll digress a little bit from maybe talking about honoring culture just for a second and come back to, films in general, stories. Like what even is the purpose of stories? And I think anyone who's seen a film that they resonated with needs to recognize, when you take in a story, it becomes a part of you. And I think that for me as a storyteller who's writing music, I'm not coming up with the visuals, but it's important to me to make sure that the stories that I help tell are bearing witness to, what is the common human experience. So we all have feelings. We're all capable of, the full emotional spectrum. That could include, joy, sadness, grief, laughter, regret, you name it. But in addition to that, stories become a way for us to sort of understand our lives and the directions that we're going. And then, what is a culture if not something that's made up of individuals who are each having different experiences? When it comes to let me make sure that I don't sidetrack too much. I can tell I'm starting to get off track. Yes. When it comes to film, it's one of my favorite modes of exposing someone to a new culture, because in a film, you're only going to get 2 hours, right? Maybe less, maybe a little bit more. They're starting to get longer these days. I don't know about you guys, but you're sitting in a seat for 3 hours. It's a long time. It's exciting, but it's a long time. And, you know, within a film, you've got maybe 2 hours to tell some story. And within that story, there's going to be a protagonist, and you need that protagonist to be relatable because you want the audience to care. And the beauty of films is that so many of them take place in places we've never been, in cultures we've never seen. And I think that, you know, similar to the conversation we're having now, like a film cannot ever fully encapsulate maybe all that some group being represented in the film wants to express, but it is a way that becomes accessible. And so one example that came out recently that was pretty cool was Raya and the Last Dragon. If any of you saw that film, you know, it's a fun romp, but it is sort of an amalgamation of a lot of different cultures. And understandably, there was some pushback going, you know, like this feels a little bit like a grab bag of, you know, maybe your favorite designs from different cultures. But the co-script writer for Raya and the Last Dragon was Malaysian born, and was trying to express in an interview, you know, we care so deeply about this world region, Southeast Asia, which had largely not been represented. And so they were trying to take elements that they thought embodied the beauty and the richness of the various cultures, which they were like, you know, there's millions of people that are spread across this world region. There's no way you're going to be able to encapsulate all of it again in one film. But it was a start, and it was a thing of beauty, and it was a work of love. And I think that audiences tend to respond to that authenticity in storytelling, and that's really all you can ask for as a composer, is that you'll work with someone who cares deeply about people first, and two, the context, and is sensitive. And you know, when if I'm going to wade into something that is totally outside of my Western cultural experience, I have to trust that whoever I'm working with is going to take me by the hand if I start to stray. Because as I said at the beginning, I don't claim to be the expert on all of this, but I do stand by trying to authentically seek the heart of a story, trying to authentically represent characters. And especially with music, it's such an emotional art form that, you know, if we all know what it feels like to feel sad, then the best thing I can do is try and write what I think feels sad to me. And if I'm writing music that isn't from a Western tradition, then I need to go and figure out what does sad sound like in other world regions, because we have songs of lament. We have music that is for communication. We have music that's for worship. We have music that's for celebration. You know, music is such a beautiful way for cultures to put their unique stamp out there in the world, saying this is kind of us. This is some of what we are. And you know, as an artist, I think that is very, very important. So you have to do the homework. You have to look into that context and not just assume like, oh, I know what this style is about. I've heard someone play tabla drum before, so I'm just going to go for it and let's see how it goes. Maybe no one will notice if you're a good musician, but I think as a composer, you really miss out on a journey that will leave you the richer for having done the digging. So you know, one of the things that I think drew me to film music initially was that I wouldn't say it's the Wild West, but as we already talked about, two separate films, there are a number of different styles that are starting to come into the fore. And as I mentioned before, I love that there are instruments outside of the Western music tradition that I can start trying to paint with. You know, and as I keep talking about the Western music tradition, and I've mentioned violins and, you know, all that before, I think it's important to realize that even a lot of those instruments that maybe we associate with the traditional orchestra, they didn't just originate in Europe. There was a cross-pollination that happened over history that led to the development of those instruments. One of the things that you'll notice if you come and join us on the 14th at the Musical Instrument Museum is that you're going to start seeing instruments that look very, very similar across different regions. And one of them is the oud. It's an instrument that has, it's a stringed instrument. It's got a nice rounded body and a couple strings on it, and absolutely beautiful woodwork done around the sound hole. And this instrument traveled up from the Middle East up into Europe and later became what we know as the lute. So you have one instrument maybe inspiring another instrument, and granted, if you just transplant it in another culture, they're going to try and figure out how do I express what my culture sounds like with this instrument. And so then the music, the music tapestry that is every style in the world starts to get a little bit bigger. And I want to stop for a second, because I think if I give you the wrong impression, I don't want to talk about music traditions as all being just kind of one big thing, because to me that might be similar to saying, like, I don't see race, I don't see skin color, which totally dismisses the uniqueness and beauty of what each culture has to offer. And all that, if I say something that misrepresents, I apologize. But yeah, I think within the tapestry of music, there's a lot to appreciate. And if you listen to something like, for example, a gamelan ensemble, this is a small orchestra of all kinds of instruments, including flutes, things that look like maybe xylophones, drums. And this is from the region of Java and Bali and Indonesia. It's going to be a little jarring if maybe you haven't heard it before, but it is absolutely beautiful. And if you listen to, say, the soundtrack of Raya and the Last Dragon, like keep your ear open. You're going to hear some things that you might not recognize. It's absolutely beautiful. So we've talked about cross-pollination, and there's a few ways that happens. I think the most healthy way is when you have arts being shared and celebrated. But obviously, throughout history, there's been music that has kind of formed out of oppression, out of the need for a culture to communicate. Like one of the most interesting exhibits that you're going to see, I think, this is subjective opinion here, but at the Musical Instrument Museum is an exhibit from South Africa. And it looks like a rain boot that's there. And you might go, what is a rain boot doing in an instrument museum? Well, the reason it's there is because there was a time when Black South Africans were basically forced to do mining work. And they were told, you're not allowed to talk. There is absolutely no communication that is allowed on your part. You are here to do work, nothing else. And they had to wear these big rubber boots for safety reasons, for uniform reasons. And so they developed a system of tapping rhythms on the boots, and that became a way of communicating to fellow co-workers. And so now there's actually a rich art form that evolved out of that, which that's good and edifying. But the reason that had to form is a sad one. So we have all these different styles of music, and some of them came out of healthier places, some of them came out of places of oppression. But the beauty of telling stories in films and incorporating those is it becomes kind of a redemptive cycle of telling an origin story, or looking compassionately at where some culture was formed. Yeah, I think I'm going to pause there for just a second. What you can't see is I actually have an array of sticky notes here, and I want to make sure that I cover some of my favorite things here. So one moment. Okay, yes. So we've talked about stories. We've talked about sort of the universal appeal of stories as far as, how we like to insert ourselves into them. But another thing to consider, this is the side that I specialize in, is music paired with stories. And the function of music can really vary. Sometimes it's very literal, where all a composer is trying to do is make someone feel, what the character's feeling. But there are other times where maybe you're trying to say something that isn't there. I think one of the most classic examples would be, I won't name the film, but let's just imagine that you're seeing footage of a beautiful beach, right? There's blue water. All you want to do is be in that water because it just looks amazing. But then you hear do 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 do. Okay, right? Like if you've seen Jaws, you know what I'm talking about. Um, and that's one of my favorite things about music is that when it's paired with a story, you can say something that is maybe not on the screen. There's a really beautiful story that I heard recently in an interview with Dario Marianelli, who is an Italian composer, lives in England. And excuse me, he was working on a film called Warrior. And in this film, there was a moment where a character had to make a very, very, very important life decision. Basically, am I going to go on this journey or not? And there was a close-up shot of a face, and it was like this really intimate moment where you're looking at the character, you're seeing the pores, you're looking in their eyes, and what needed to happen is the audience needed to realize this main character has come to a decision. And when the shot was just on its own without music, it wasn't really translating, it wasn't landing. And so Dario Marianelli saw an opportunity to go, okay, well musically I can express that. I've been invested in this character from the start of this film. I've tried to compassionately make this theme I've associated with him develop. And in that moment, he wrote music that then confirmed that this character had made a decision. So, there's this interplay between visuals and music where you don't want to be too literal and on the nose. And it can be helpful when maybe the music's saying something that's not directly on the screen. So there's kind of two ways to approach this. One is scoring to the scene, which is looking at what's happening generally and just sort of painting a general mood, or they're scoring to the hit, which if any of you have seen like Bourne Ultimatum movies or any action movies, it's like someone throws a punch and maybe there's like a drum hit or a cymbal crash and everything's kind of reacting to everything on the screen. But one of my favorite things, and I think the scores that have helped shape me and inform the way that I'd like to write, have themes that get associated with either characters or ideas. And this is I think a classic example. Look at Star Wars. If you saw Star Wars The Force Awakens, the Rey theme, or the theme for the character Rey, starts very, very small, very, very small. It sounds like humble origins, instruments that don't sound in and of themselves strong. You have a flute and a celeste, this kind of tinkly, starry sounding keyboard instrument. And when you hear it, you're not thinking like, cool, yeah, this is going to be the hero. They're going to, kick butt and take names. No. You have a very humble origin story. And then if you've seen the film, that Rey goes through some serious adventure and learns a lot about herself and grows in confidence. And by the end of the film, there's a scene where she's in the Millennium Falcon and it comes back. But this time it comes back with the full support of an orchestra, with horns, with drums, with sweeping strings, and her theme's still there, but you're given to understand musically that she's gone on a journey, she's grown. Similarly, I had an opportunity to score, I think, what will probably be one of the most personal and emotional films for me I've ever done earlier this year. Some of you saw it in February. This was the film Sometimes I Shake. And it was about the late Professor Dan Nelson. And for those of you who don't know, Dan was a band director. He conducted, he loved music with every fiber of his being. And he had ALS and he had Parkinson's before that. So, he had shakes. And I latch on to composers that I feel show true compassion for their characters. And when we were talking about how do we even make this music work for this story, Jared, the director, told me, I want you to think about like broken things that are, like castaway instruments. And what we ended up doing was trying to feature instruments playing very, very quietly, but turning that volume up so that you can hear the rich and intimate detail of those instruments. And the way I think about it is it's kind of a musical way to try and parallel what happened to Dan, which is you watch Dan's life decrescendo, which is a musical term for get quieter and get smaller as he's losing sort of the function of his body. But I think you're watching a crescendo, or an increase in volume and strength in the way that he lived his life with intention. And so trying to feature these small and instrument or intimate sounds, but they're kind of pull the volume up where you can hear them, and they're present, they don't sound maybe quite as weak. Felt like a way to parallel and give that meaning, give that even the music a meaning in as it relates to the story. And that's that can be a really difficult thing to do as a writer. It was a struggle for me, but thankfully I had a collaborator who was very, very compassionate, very, very patient with me, and was willing to kind of guide me. Sometimes I'd throw ideas at the wall and they were the wrong ones. And you just have to trust the process and trust that your collaborator is going to steer you right. So yeah, let's see. Moving on to our next point. Yeah, I think it might be appropriate for me to share two of the most meaningful movie moments for me that kind of drive me and make, that they embody sort of the kinds of stories that I'd like to tell. One is, if you haven't seen it, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood with Tom Hanks. Absolutely beautiful film. Spoiler alert, it's great. Go watch it. There's a moment there where I'm not giving any, I'm not giving a huge plot spoiler here, but there's a moment where there's a character facing death. They know that they're going to die, which if you've lived in America, you know that death is not something that we're like, yeah, let's talk about it, right? Like let's have some coffee and let's talk about death. This movie very, very compassionately waded into something that scares a lot of people. And there's this moment where the character played by Tom Hanks, Mr. Rogers, says to another guy who is aware that he's dying, and he says basically about death, if it's human, it's mentionable. And you watch relief kind of wash over the man who knows that he's dying, because it's scary to talk about something like that. And that really, really struck a chord with me, because there's so much that is human that needs to be mentioned. And it seems like, if any of you watched any of the films that were Oscar nominated or won Oscars this year, it was a really, really interesting year for films. It felt like, Callie and I were talking about this after the awards. It felt like a year of smaller films that came to the forefront. I don't know about you guys, but when I've watched Oscars in the past, there are, usually like period dramas or maybe some epic adventure tale. And those are super, super fun. I really hope I get to write music for one of those someday. But this year there were films like Minari and Sound of Metal. And you cannot watch these films and come away thinking that the directors just didn't like people. You will come away feeling like, man, I really took a journey with someone who had a very different experience than I had. Minari is the story of, Korean immigrants basically trying to make a life for themselves, and you see the cultural struggles and frictions that they're up against, and you see them battling it out against the elements. You see inter-family drama, which I don't care what cultural background you're from. That's not true. I do care a lot about what cultural background you're from, but everybody has felt tension within their family. That's relatable, and that's what I'm talking about with films. Whether you have a character that you're familiar with, you go, oh, it's like the guy who works at the office. Like I can relate to that guy. Or if it's someone completely different, some part of their struggle is going to resonate with you. And I think that's if you watch a film that moves you to the core like that and gives you a lesson in empathy, that is really the best way that you can honor a culture, because you've taken someone on an authentic journey and given people handles, to grab onto something that maybe they'd never encountered before, with something that's maybe familiar and universal within that. So I don't want to go too much longer, or I will completely talk over the Q&A section. I see we're approaching 12:45, so maybe I'll put a pin in it and stop there.
Amazing, Scott. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm like taking so many notes, and I appreciate your sticky notes and all of the thoughts that you've shared with us today. Reminder to the audience, yes, please do feel free and put questions in the chat box. We would love to ask those of Scott. Maybe just to begin, Scott, something that I've been thinking about is just how much intentionality and care and thought goes into music scoring, goes into discovering music and being a good storyteller. You continued to repeat, I think, the phrase doing the homework. When you're approached with a new project, how do you begin getting curious and asking questions and starting to like wrap your mind around what does doing the homework look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, first thing, if there's an instrument that I don't play, I will either pull out a book or look on YouTube, which, you know, YouTube's a veritable treasure trove these days. There's a lot that you can find there, or I'll go on Spotify and try and find people who play the instrument that I'm trying to understand, and listen to what it sounds like idiomatically. And by idiomatically, I mean like how it was sort of intended to be played by the masters of that instrument. What does it do well? Because if I come at it and try and use it in a way that it's not meant to be played, like there's times where that's really required. That's good to try and experiment and get a new sound. But, you know, especially if you have a story that's not set in America, like I did a really short promo. That wasn't a promo. It was sort of an informational documentary about a United Nation effort in Armenia involving agriculture. And that became an opportunity for me to use some of the instruments in the region, one of which was a duduk. And, you know, you kind of draw on some instruments that, even if they didn't totally come from Armenia itself, they're close enough to give people a sense of place. And it's a delicate dance, but that's kind of where I try to start, is figure out, you know, how is this instrument even played, and what's the significance to the culture that it came from? Because if you're not doing that, then, you know, you could misstep really quick.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We had a great question come in from Ryan, and I'm reading it right now.
Okay.
I appreciate your thoroughness, Ryan. He's talking about Goranson and scene setting, where in some films it requires a sort of semiotic flourish and quickly establishing distinctness and difference from the rest of the story. He says there are places where you hear the sort of problematic appropriative parodies of a regional style more frequently. You were kind of talking a little bit about how we don't want to be appropriative towards different cultures.
Right.
Ryan asked, given production timelines, restricting research, film frames, given all of the obstacles that, you know, we're given when creating a movie or a film, how do you, as a composer, go about respectively approaching challenges like those? Oh,
well, then you get busy on your homework when you're not doing the movie beforehand. You know, I mentioned earlier that there were a lot of instruments that I heard growing up that, you know, part of what's, you know, now in there, and again, I'm not saying that I just totally understand all these instruments and understand them inside and out, but I've heard them played idiomatically. And so I think for anyone who wants to jump in, you know, try to put yourself in a position where you don't have to just jump in. Listen widely, you know, seek out something that's other than what you're familiar with right now when the pressure is not on. When the pressure is on, you know, start doing the research, because he's absolutely right. Deadlines are insane on some productions. It's like miraculous sometimes that music gets done at the level that it's done. And it's anytime you see at the end of like a big feature film, you know, I don't know if any of you saw Jungle Cruise, or how many people actually stick around to watch the credits scroll, because it's not as interesting to watch names go by. But I think it's really a testament to how much of a team game making music for a movie or just making a movie is. It involves so many people at the most, the highest level. And, for me, if there's something I don't understand, I'll consult Google, certainly. But if there's someone that I know who maybe is an expert in that field, like, I'll ask them for help. I think these days it's easy to feel pressure to try and do things yourself. As an American culture, we're very like, do it yourself, pick yourselves up by your bootstraps, find the solution. You're gonna get there if you just try hard enough. And there's times where, that kind of grit and independence is important, but don't forget that dependence can be a really communal, shared thing. There's people who want to help, and there's people who know better than you. Ask them for help. People want to help. I think at our roots, we want to help other people. And it's really, really exciting to help within a creative field. That's part of why I'm still here. It's like, oh my gosh, I've assisted, people on various productions, be it albums or preparing the sheet music and, for a session, but I wouldn't have if they hadn't asked for help and I hadn't known about it.
I appreciate that. I think you're speaking to that collaborative process and just being humble and doing what you know that you do well, but then seeking help from others. And I imagine that could be applied to so many different art forms as well, maybe not just music composition, but I appreciate that. We loved hearing a little bit about your background and your experience as a child in Japan. Ron asked a question. He asked, how do you expose children to cultural music? Can you talk a little bit more about how we might be able to influence the children in our lives?
Yeah, I think if you go on Spotify and start looking, if you can find a good book on ethnomusicology or just look up world music, there's going to be all kinds of resources. And, you'll have to, for yourself, a little bit vet some of those, because not every resource is going to be authentic. But there's also a lot of footage and field recordings available on YouTube. So if you were to search, name of country traditional music, you're going to see a lot populate in your search field on YouTube and similarly on Spotify. And if you look up, like, what are some of the instruments within a certain world region, and then look up, best player of fill in the instrument in the search field, you're going to start to find artists you've never heard before. And you're going to hear them just shredding. Maybe they won't be shredding, but like showing virtuosity on an instrument that you haven't been listening to. And then, it's a process of discovery. I think it's easy these days to try and rely on algorithms to sort of be like, we heard you liked this, so try this out. And if you never look beyond that, then you'll get stuck maybe in a rut of music that all sounds the same, which for some people is comforting, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just think, it's a great question. You just have to go looking on YouTube, Spotify, and again, like a world music book. You might even be able to find a digital copy and save yourself the trouble of going to the library. But as I say that, go to libraries. Libraries are also treasure troves. You might find some really good resources there.
Yes, I agree. I love the library. Curious, any advice that you might have to folks who are wanting to get into this industry in film composition? How did you first get your start? And there was a question about how would one go about finding opportunities for composing music projects?
Oh man, I remember asking, big name composers these very questions and hearing back from some and not from others, because they're just really busy. I would say, if you want to move forward, form relationships. I know that I've said that already, and it can sound like, yeah, I get, form relationships, but how do you really, it really doesn't go beyond that. Form relationships. If you're someone who knows how to write music and you know someone else who makes movies, talk to the person who makes movies and say, hey, I really want to try writing music for your movie. And, for me, I was fortunate in that I came into the same, physical, well, proximity to Larry Wrench often at church when I was living in LA. And Larry knows a ton about orchestration that I don't know. And I could ask him questions and ask him questions even beyond orchestration, just like things about the industry that I didn't understand. Or, when you come into this discipline, there's a lot of terms. It can be overwhelming. And it could feel easy to go like, oh, you know what, I need to get another degree, because there's a lot of film scoring, programs out there. I don't think you necessarily have to go to a film scoring program if you are interested in writing music. There's a lot of resources online. One of the groups that I will mention that helped me a lot is the Society of Composers and Lyricists. If you're really serious about wanting to write music for film, they have all kinds of well, fewer in-person meetings, obviously, over the last little while, but they have a mentorship program that you can apply to. It happens every year. I am a member of an organization called ASCAP, which is a performance rights organization. So if you search ASCAP and look up film and TV, they have stuff on YouTube. They have resources for you. There's lots of people that know specifically kind of where to get a foothold and what resources to turn you on to. And I can share those, but I think for anyone trying to get into that, because I'm still working to establish myself, talk to someone who's, I guess, quote unquote, higher up on the food chain, because you don't assume that people just don't have time for you. Be persistent, and just because it's hard to get a foot in, because it is hard, it may take 10 years or more, honestly, to find sustainable work. Just because it's hard doesn't mean it's the wrong pursuit for you, but be authentic first and form relationships. That's the way to do it.
I appreciate that. Good advice. As you talk about growing your career, somebody asked if you have like a dream project, to a dream score that you'd like to do someday.
Oh, that's a good question. From a musical standpoint, like if they remade Lord of the Rings, I wouldn't touch it because they did such a good job. But if that hadn't been made, I would have done Lord of the Rings. You've seen it. It's awesome. But that said, I used to think that big sweeping scores and epic tales, were what I really wanted to do, which, don't get me wrong, I 100% would do that if that opportunity came along. But after watching films like Minari and A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, there are films that are there purely for entertainment. There are films that are there to challenge viewers. And I think I like films that offer a lot. There's maybe some adventure, but there's a lot of compassion. I think, my ideal film, I couldn't even tell you what it is, just something that has a lot of compassion for humanity. Well, the Dan film, doing that with Jared, I mean, again, I knew Dan personally, so there's a whole nother layer there. But I know Jared, and Jared like really, really loves people a lot, like a lot, and will journey very, very closely with them in their struggles. And for me, as looking for someone who's a collaborator, like ticks all the boxes, that's the kind of person that I want to collaborate with, because you're going to spend a lot of time talking, communicating, throwing ideas back and forth, and you need someone that you can get along with and who has compassion and empathy.
Love that. Well, as we wrap up, one more question. Curious what your favorite unique musical instrument is.
Oh, man. Okay, favorite unique musical instrument. Ooh, that's tough. You talk to any composer in the business right now and they'll be like, oh, there's like 5. Maybe. It could feel like a cop-out, but I really love the piano. I think it is wonderfully expressive. I think that it's crazy that they devised a way of hammering the strings the way that they do. There's all kinds of objects you can put between the strings to make it sound different and create spooky and percussive sounds. And for me, probably because it's what I started learning on, it's really, really expressive. And anyone who says that the piano is just kind of a vanilla answer, I love vanilla ice cream. It's delicious. So you take that back.
I agree. I love that. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott, for sharing today. We learned so much.
My pleasure.
I wanted to bring up Katie. Katie is our alumni board regional representative in Arizona. Katie, could you tell us about the event this weekend?
Yes. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Scott, so much. I learned so much today, and it's always so interesting. We have so many alumni that just do such interesting work that I love to hear about it. So thank you so much. I'm excited for this weekend. On Saturday, August 14th, we're going to be having like a community field trip to the Musical Instrument Museum, which is in Phoenix. If you're in this area, I know Scott mentioned it a couple times in his talk. I have never been there personally, so I'm super excited to see all the stuff that he was mentioning and just to kind of have that whole experience. We're going to be getting a guided tour that starts at 10:30. Check-in or registration is from 10 to 10:30. We will have a booth outside of the founder's room at the museum. And the guided tour will take about an hour. Once that's finished, they're going to end the tour at a little cafe area where you can pick up something to eat there, something to drink, and then we can go back to the founder's room and chat with each other if we'd like. Scott's going to be there. He can answer questions. And then also you're free to go back into the museum, and they're going to be providing you at the beginning of the tour with some headphones because it's like an interactive, am I right, Scott? It's like an interactive museum. So you can take the tour, then mingle a little bit, and then you're free to go back into the museum as you like and take the guided tour, which seems really fun too. So like I said, that is the registration or check-in is from 10 to 10:30. The tour starts at 10, and then we have a room with some tables and chairs set up that'll be go until 1, and then you're free to go about the museum. So excited. I hope to see some people there that we know.
I'm in San Diego, and I wish that I was in Arizona this weekend. That sounds amazing.
You could take a road trip, Kimberly.
I could take a road trip. Anybody could take a road trip, and you can register pointloma.edu/Loma Talks. I put the link in the chat box. There are also some upcoming talks and different events in different regions, so please visit that website. Stay tuned. Thank you again, Scott. We really appreciated our conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good afternoon.